Bonjour tout le monde. Hello, Ani, and welcome to our this morning's session. So this week we are celebrating Métis history, identity, and culture at Laurentian University. And we have a very special guest with us this morning, and I'm very excited to get to our great conversation. So before we begin, I would like to honor the traditional territory of the Atikamekw and Anishinaabe, on which Laurentian University is situated, as well as Wanapate First Nation, on which the city of Greater Sudbury is situated. And of course, the Treaty of Robinson-Huron of 1850. And again, because we're in a virtual setting, I would like to honor and respect all of the treaties and traditional territories on which all of our participants are sitting today. And of course, we couldn't have this wonderful discussion without the Métis people of this territory and so many other territories joining us. So we want to acknowledge and respect and really get to know more about some of these histories and identities. And we are lucky enough to hear from Richard Meilleur on his experiences. He'll be sharing his journey and his experiences surrounding his Métis identity, culture, questions of citizenship, and we will discuss a little bit of the Powley test to see how this applies to people in Ontario and maybe from coast to coast. So we're really grateful to have everyone joining us today, have some familiar faces and some new faces, so thank you for joining us. Our goal today is to learn from Rick's experience and of course, from everyone on the line. So we will have time for conversation and discussion. We would like to ask that while Rick is speaking, that you keep yourself muted, and we'll have a nice conversation. If you have questions, please go into the chat. So we'll try and get to as many of the questions as we can. And then we'll, of course, have opportunities for discussion so that everyone can have a little bit of conversation with Rick so that we can talk about all of the nuance that we experience in Ontario. Things with the MNO and citizenship and all kinds of questions. So Rick is always very knowledgeable. I always have a lot to learn every time we talk. So I'm looking forward to today and we'll get to all of those great topics in due time. We have a lot to cover, right, Rick?
Yes, ma'am.
So I'm going to pass it over to you, Rick, and you can tell us a little bit about your story. And I might butt in once in a while to ask you some of the questions from the chats, or maybe I'm curious as well. So we'll try and get to as many of those questions as possible. So I'll turn it over to you. Again, thank you for sharing your time with us. Rick is from Le Centre Louis Riel at Collège Boréal. So he has experiences in post-secondary education as well. So we can talk about those topics as well. Okay, so I'll pass it over to you.
Allez, bonjour tout le monde. De Dijnakaz Zonde, No Dodem, Makwa, Ni Don Jabba, Witimigosh Sibi. My name is Rick Meilleur. My spiritual name is Zonde, means strong heart. And I belong to the Bear clan, and I come from the French River area. Me as a Métis, I started questioning that identity when I was 7 years old. To my mother, my grandmother, but they weren't saying they were Métis. They were only saying we're something else. We're not pure native Indian in the day, but we're something else. So as I grew, asked more questions, went to a school. It was 6 grades in one classroom. Couldn't figure out why we were going in that school while other schools just a mile away from us had big schools with gyms and all that, and we didn't have gyms or nothing. But all the families that surrounded us were either First Nation or Métis. They used to identify as Métis. So I kept questioning, what is Métis? And then they say this, the older people. And then when I got to my 20s, 30s, up to 30, then I went with the computers. Computers started coming out and then do research. Then I found out, yes, we are Métis. So in 1996, Tony came around this region in Sudbury, in Wallville, Alban, River Valley, and had a discussion with the family. And that's where he says, you're definitely all Métis. So he did research for some families, yes. So there was no problem. Everybody was happy. Even my grandmother, when she found out, like she said, now we could really say who we are. And she was around, I don't know, 90 at the time. So everything was going good for a good 15 years, let's say. They had to come here to build up the citizenship of MNO. We joined MNO. We didn't have other organizations before that. We just did what we felt was right for us as a right, as somebody else, like, native and something, mixed bloods, whatever. So nobody that's in the families got hunting licenses, whatever. We just did it when it was time to do it. And everybody was living on little farms. So we could take whatever we harvested to the farms, butcher it ourselves, and nobody knew. So as we came along, then we were doing the harvesting, but then, like Tony said, well, we should have rights, establish our rights, not just do it à cachette, they say. So that's when the Powley case came. So Steve Powley, he went hunting, harvested his moose because he was tired of hiding like everybody else was doing. So he called M&R. They came, charged him. He was with OMA, the Ontario Métis Aboriginal Association at the time. So, but then Tony, they switched from OMA to MNO in 93. So that made a little bit of confusion with OMA and MNO because OMA was saying Steve is a member of OMA and not MNO. But Steve just wanted his rights. If I don't know if anybody knew Steve Pauly at the time, he was just a normal guy living a normal life and caring for his family. That's all he was worried about. So they were trying to convince him to do it for everybody. Like harvesting rights should be for everybody. It took him a while, and then he decided, yeah, because we had numerous talks, the families with him and all that. So he said, I'll do it on one basis. Like if I do it for everybody, that means everybody, not just a section of people. So they agreed on that. So he won the court case. It's too bad a year later he passed away. He didn't enjoy it too much. But then we continued harvesting, and then the MNR was still after us because they were saying you can only harvest north of 17, not south. So that was eliminating, let's say, the French River, Georgian Bay, all the Western Ontario. So that didn't go too good. So the families got together and we all went harvesting. We got charged. And by that time, it dragged on. So around 2007, I do believe we went to court, members of the family, and they won their court case. And then people were able to harvest south and north of Highway 17. But now, after in 2015, it started to change. Uh, it was like a new government, MNO. They were gearing up for the western part of the Métis. So they did, when Pauly won his court case, they started working on historical communities. So they developed Mattawa first because of the trading post that was there, 1884, up to North Bay, halfway up the Nipissing Lake. And then for some reason or another, they jumped over French River area uh, and went to Killarney. And that's where I started rising up. And I said, well, aren't you going to do the research for the French River area? So they stood up 3 times in general meetings in AGA and said, we'll do the research very soon. So they said, calm down, be prepared, everybody will get your rights back, because we had lost our rights in 2015 because we weren't connected to Mattawa. We went through Mattawa, but didn't establish there. We established in the French River. So it discouraged a lot of people, but I kept on pushing, pushing. And then the last response I got was, we would have to hire a translator because all the documents are all in French and it would be too costly. So to me, that didn't make sense. You know what I mean? Too costly. That was the no history, Ryan. So I said, that doesn't make sense to me. So I kept on pushing and pushing till I had enough. Uh, I had a great time with M&O. I did all kinds of stuff for M&O. When they wanted something to be done, the harvesting or music or tradition, culture, teachings, whatever, they called upon us, this region, to work. Because I used to laugh, because I used to say, after they were saying that we're not part of that homeland no more, my ancestors come from the homeland, but because they didn't stay there and establish themselves there, they continued the fur trade. So they went to Quebec and then went to the States, went back to Quebec. And the early 1860s, they were in Ontario, in the Ottawa area. And then 1895 on, that's when they established themselves in the French River. So then I said, well, that doesn't make sense. So I started my own organization, the Métis Nipissing Families. And the goal there wasn't to really get out of M&O, but it's a family thing. So it was like a family organization, just to get more research done, do it ourselves, and get established with M&O. But then when M&O found that out, well, then they suspended me, of course, because you can't have two organizations, which a lot of them do have, two cars, double cars. But the idea was to try to help them and help, let's say, our people in this region, Region 5, they used to call. So I was let go, and now I got my own, and it's going pretty good. We're in talks with everybody, and with the knowledge I have from M&O, I could use that to our advantage with our organization. So with the Powley, it was a good thing. It was a bad thing because there's loopholes in there. And the loophole is, the judge had said that it's not all Métis people that established themselves in a Western community. A lot of them were travelers, like with the fur trade, but they went from town to town to town. They could have lived there for 1 year and then move on to another town and then move on to another one and then went back home. Most of the time was Quebec or Ontario. So whoever made the census or the Métis script, they weren't there at the time because they didn't have no property. They were living with somebody else or whatever. So does that mean that those people are less Métis than the ones that stayed out west on lands? To me, no. Uh, but now it only takes somebody to challenge that, because nobody in Ontario challenged that loophole of Métis being mobile, not just staying in one place. So we'll be working on that, because as we did research, we were deemed like a freeman, they call. So that's people that were in the fur trade and put a lot of time in the fur trade, and the king gave them permission to organize their own political government themselves, where they established themselves. Like in Quebec, they came from this community, Petite Nation, which was an Algonquin community, until they changed it, like when the French wave came in. So they were pushed out, went in the Ottawa Valley, and then eventually Nouvelle. But Nouvelle is interesting in the French River because Monetteville, the story is, and they got a lot of proof, is Cyril Monette was actually Louis Riel's best friend. So that's why our family was always connected. Everybody knew about Louis Riel because he used to go into those little towns, Ripon, Saint Andre, Maniwaki, and all that, Otter Lake, because Cyril Monet, his real name was Alexandre Boisvert. He changed his name because when Louis Riel got married with Monette G. Bedmar, he took her maiden name, changed that. So, because he was part of the rebellion out west, came back here, and then he moved back out west. But in 1895, he was here. And everybody that established those little communities along the French River, Monetteville is where the Nipissing flows into the French River. So everybody had to go through there to establish themselves. They came here because they were given land and they had to cultivate, for 5 acres. I can't remember for many years there. And if they wouldn't do that, they would lose their land. But our families, well, they cultivated, they got the land going. A lot of them were lumberjacks after the fur trade. Some stayed in as voyageurs up to, they were recorded in 1911 as voyageurs still, senior voyageurs. So the poly is good. It helped everybody because it took MNO 10 years to establish that court case, while Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, they were in courts for 30 years trying to get the same rights. And when Ontario got the rights, well, that gave rights to the Western prairies to harvest also. Some worked good, some didn't work as well because of the provincial governments. But here it worked well, but about 500 lost that privilege after having it for 15 to 18 years. So after you have a right, you're not supposed to lose a right. So that's what everybody's working on right now, because we could be other Métis, like M&O is telling me, let's say, uh, I'm not a real Métis, I'm a mixed blood from the first wave. So what I'm saying is, if I'm a mixed blood from the first wave, I should have the same right because I was here before you. It was, the mixed bloods were established before the Métis, let's say. But the word Métis, all depends how you word it, like the definition, because the true definition is mixed bloods with First Nation and European people. Even Louis Riel said it, and that's why Louis Riel said the Eastern Métis and Western Métis are the same people. So it's good. It's still working. Like Powley case is still working, but MNO is working on something too because they want mobility rights. Because the ones that belong to MNO that come from the Western prairies, they can't harvest over here. Um, like some say, they shouldn't have no rights at all, like in Ontario, because they come from out west, born and raised. But I don't look at it that way. A Métis, a Métis. When Tony Belcourt, when he came to see us and he told us, you're Métis, truly Métis. When he seen the traditions we were doing, the trapping and the music, the same type of music and all, he says, and the way we were speaking, he says, you're Métis. And we accepted that and we welcome Tony because he comes from Alberta. And then we welcome everybody else that came from out west. But in 2016 on, that started to change. The Westerners that are with MNO are brushing the Métis of this region away. Is that a good thing? I don't know. I think in our case, we accept everybody. It doesn't matter where you come from. A Métis is a Métis. And we're not looking to be rich. We're not looking to have power. And I think that's what's happening in the MNO is power and money. Now they're receiving all kinds of money. And now you see what's happening when people get a lot of money. The MNO is fighting with MNC back and forth. They're starting their own tri-party government. And like the MNC is saying that the Ontario communities are not truly Métis communities; they're Algonquin or Ojibwe communities. So the fight that like it created a big fight between everybody. So for us, well, we're here, we're used to this land, and it's going good. People are listening. I've been around for a long time, so when I open doors, they know who I am already. I did stuff for them, for the governments and all that. So it's a little bit better for me to talk, and hopefully it goes good. And then if we do get recognized, we're not going to get recognized as the historical community, but I'm working like the Algonquin. It's a new treaty. It's not a treaty from the old day. It's a modern treaty, and we're going for modern community of the day. That's been like we've been there for over 125 years. So I'll stop there because I don't know if I'm missing something. I might be babbling. I'll stop there in case somebody wants to ask me a question about whatever I talked about.
You touched on a lot already, so I'm sure that we'll have lots of questions, probably all over the place, from Powley to citizenship to harvesting rights. You touched on something that I'm always curious about, and it's great to get everyone's opinion on this and how everyone perceives it. Do you think that like the semantics around the word Métis are always what seems to come up? We hear little m, big M, Western, Eastern Métis, you hear words like mixed blood or half breed, or so there's so many different ways to identify. Do you think that the language, the fact that people may speak French as opposed to English as their first language, if not Michif or some mixture of those languages, do you think that that makes a difference in how people identify? That maybe francophones identify a certain way because of the word métis in French, versus people who may have used the word métis in English in a different setting? Do you see a difference with that when you speak to people?
I do, because like the Western mischief, you know, it's totally different. It depends which section you go. Like if you go in the northern parts compared to the southern parts of the western prairies, I just give you an example. I went to Manitoba. I was doing all the prairies, talking with a lot of people. When I got to Saint Malo in Manitoba, they had their annual General Assembly. So I just dropped by and walked in, danced, whatever, spoke with them. There was presidents from other um Métis councils. After we had our fun for about 2 3 hours, and they asked me. They said, "Well, where do you live? We don't see you too often around here." I said, "Well, I come from Sudbury, Ontario." And they all looked at me and said, "Oh, you moved there? You come from here? You moved to Sudbury?" I said, "No, I was born and raised in that area." And they couldn't believe the same words, the same dancing music like I had over here with them. It was the same thing. So they welcomed me, like, and it was funny because one president said, "Well, there's no Métis in Ontario. How can you speak that way? How can you, act this way? You fit right in with us." Well, I said, "We must be the same people, right?" And then you go out east, and then Dermichif is, you know, they call it Métif, like M accent aigu TEF, Métif. So that was like in the Jesuit time. So, but that's Cajun, totally different. But they identify as where they come from, right? And it's not. You could say nobody has the same language. Like the Michif language here, I wouldn't say it's Michif. You know, in this French River area up to, let's say, Timmins, where M&O, they started the Michif language, and I was the first one with Jerry and France establishing that. But it's the old joual, the joual. Like Quebec says that never exists, whatever. Because if you spoke the joual, you were non-educated and whatever, blah blah. Uh, but that's what we say if you want to say this is a Michif language, the Michif language of, just say, French River Nipissing area. Yeah, I don't know. That's hard to say. Hard to say. There's a lot of talks about that.
Well, it's great that you share your experience that way because you've traveled, and I think you can see when you're accepted into a group of people that you just recently met, but you see that the cultures are parallel, they're similar. You know that those are your cousins if you want to look at it that way, right? We're all related. So it's interesting that you've had that chance to travel and have some of those experiences. And we did have a good talk with Tony Belcourt last year. You've had talks with him in the past, and so his understanding of who is a Métis person is pretty clear. And I know that there are scholars who question how the Métis communities and self-identification have increased, right? We've seen huge increases over the last couple of years. Tony doesn't see it that way. So how do you perceive that? Why are people identifying in huge numbers now? Is it just because there's more understanding? Is it because people are finding out new information and researching their ancestry? You've seen this at Collège Boreal in your personal experience too. So how do you see all of these this transitioning occurring in the Sudbury area or anywhere else?
Well, around here, people know that they're mixed bloods. Like most of the people, they know because the grandparents talked about it and all that. There's some people that they do research, but they'll find, let's say, a native woman in the 1600s, one of the, like we do have one like that, but we don't call ourselves, let's say, mixed blood or Métis because of that Indian woman marrying the first white in the church, and that was 1644. So you can't really call yourself. She was Algonquin, so you would be an Algonquin descent. I still identify as a Métis Algonquin because we come from the Algonquin nation. Um, but the one from out west was from the Kootenays, around the Rocky Mountain House. But a lot of people think that, they're Métis because of an ancestor in the 1600s, but nobody ever lived the Métis way. The key word is the way of life, right? If you never talked about your grandparents or great grandparents, nobody knows nothing, even your parents. A lot of parents don't even know. They know, oh, we heard we had Indian blood in us. Well, to me, you can't really say you're Métis because it's the way you live or what you did in your lifetime, what your grandparents did, and it's a trend, and it goes down to generation to generation. But I believe there's Métis. If you want to define Métis as native or European, yes, there's a lot of Métis around. Like Quebec would be full of Métis because it all started there. They all came from the St. Lawrence and down, right? And then they all went out west. It's the Eastern people that explored out west. Because the first 1799 at Rocky Mountain House, that was the first fur trade post that was established. It was burned 2 3 times because of rivalry, but they've been doing it since 1999. Before, like going to the Sioux, Mackinac Island, and all that the upper Great Lakes, Superior. So, to me, question of being Métis, it's who you believe you are, what you know as a person, and what you do as a person. And you got to be able to teach that. If you don't teach it, then your line is gone, right? So I know there's a lot of people out there that really aren't Métis, you know, because I talk to them and whatever, and it's a make believe sometimes. You say, oh, it sounds that, but then when you redo the research, it's not really what they're thinking. Like, you say, no, that's not what it says. There's something else here. But in my region, there's a lot. I would say there's a lot of Métis because the French River was established by that because they all came back because they went through that route. You know what I mean? To establish themselves. So I don't know if that's good enough.
Complicated, right? That's what you're getting
Very
at. Yeah,
complicated.
it's
Very.
complicated. And I think you touched on a good point saying finding out that you have an ancestor versus a way of life and having cultural transmission, that you're learning certain things, skills, culture from your parents and your grandparents, and it's part of your communal identity and your personal identity, right? So I think you touched on that. That's a great point. Do you think that maybe,
Because
go ahead.
I just want to say, because I thought of something, because the Métis definition changes so much. Like a few years back, around 2015, that's where it all started, right? This thing. And to be a Métis, the definition was a mixed blood would marry another mixed blood, and the children of those two mixed bloods would be Métis. So that complicated stuff, right? But still, a lot of families, Métis usually marry cousins, in the family. It's well known. And a lot of family, that's what happened. Like, two mixed bloods, two married their cousins, and, they should be Métis, considered Métis, and they lived the way, but they weren't considered Métis because of not staying in the homeland long enough. You see. So the big M and small m, that's still going on with M&O because they got, I wouldn't say half, but close to half of the citizens just say that they're there, but they can't sit on council. They can't participate in some issues. So that's what we always said there was a big M and small m, and M&O used to say, no, it's one category of Métis and that's it, But the small M that I call the ones that have no rights to sit on council still have an old M&O card, and the ones that are verified section 35, they have a totally different card, and they're the ones that could sit on council and be part of the consultations and all kinds of stuff, right? But the people, they call them grandfathered in, they're the ones that build that M&O to where they are. They all they they started the consultation, they started everything, and now they're being pushed away without realizing. A lot of people don't follow the let's say their own organization. They don't have a clue what's going on. You go to an AGA and it's basically the same people that's been going for the last 10 years, you know, same people going all the time. The rest, they don't want to bother. And what I keep telling people, if you don't bother, that means you don't care about the people. Like you got to be part. They say you're with M&O, you got to be part of M&O. You got to be active. If they, if you never see your name anywhere, well, people are going to say, okay, you got a Métis card, but are you really Métis? You're not involved into any discussions. When it's time for fighting for rights, are you there behind them? No. Well, you know what I mean? So you got to be strong. You got to show that you're proud of who you are. That's what I want to say.
It seems really complicated when you're looking at things like citizenship and then rights derived from that citizenship. And also, it sounds like the organization that you created started really as an advocacy group. Am I getting that right? That you were just trying to advocate for the families in your area, the history that you knew, and you wanted to increase the research in the French River area, right?
Right.
And so do you think that this is a way of kind of having the government conquer and divide Métis people amongst themselves so that they're more focused on who is and who is not Métis rather than who's actually benefiting from some of these land deals, which is, industry and government? Do you have any opinions on that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think they want to eliminate, the government wants to eliminate, I'm sure, less Métis people that, they got to care. But then the organization themselves, when they get money in their hands and more power, then they want to eliminate people too. As for lands and resources, the way it's working is like, let's say the Ontario group, they got mining, forestry, the hydro, whatever. They got partnerships with that. If they would bring that and put it back in the communities or have the community councils in charge of that money, let's say like Subway's got a lot of mining, they get money from the mines to run, but most of the part goes to the head office, and then the head office, well, they share that with their Western counterparts. So you know what I mean? Like it shouldn't be shared with somebody else. It should be staying right here, where if it's mining, where it stays here. Like Timmins, they got mining, they sign an IBA impacts them, so that always be there, and it'll stay in Timmins. Other parts, well, it's just a money grab to help the big empire to grow. Like now, if you really think about it, there's two empires, like like MNO, Saskatchewan and Alberta. I do believe they signed tri-party, but they still belong to MNC, which they have still have the five provinces with British Columbia. So to me, that's like double dipping. You know what I mean? Like they got two parties belong to one party, and they're talking about simple guys like me having two cards. But we got to ask ourselves, the ones that were born in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, do they have an Alberta card? Do they have a Saskatchewan card or Manitoba and have an MNO card? So, you know what I mean? They're still two card holders. That means they benefit from their own province and they benefit from their outside province. So that's a big question too. A lot of people are asking, right? Like I sat on council as vice president, councilor two, three times, senator, uh, had a great time with everything up till now that I just want to do like research on the French and all that, and right away they banned me. So to me, it's people that don't really have a heart no more. Like an old elder told me, if the upper executives lives in big towns, like Ottawa, Toronto, whatever, their heart doesn't burn no more. It gets hard like a rock. So the the love of the people is not there. It's the love of the money and the love of the power. And I'll stop there.
Well, thanks for sharing. I'd love to hear from if there's questions or comments from anyone with us today. I shared a few links in the chat. So you shared one about the Powley case and the Powley test. And those are pretty intricate legal documents. So to read through them, you can see where there could be loopholes, specifically when looking at Métis historical communities. So I also shared a link in the chat about that. So historic Métis communities in Ontario. And so as far as you're concerned, do you think that the French River should be a historical Métis community based on your research?
I do believe so. Uh, because it's the way it's going, like they did Killarney. And Killarney in the day, and with, let's say, the little towns like Bigwood, Alban, that was all part of Killarney. You know what I mean? So if Killarney stays as, which I doubt, but if it stays as a historic community, uh, we'll be able to link that to those little towns,
Mhm.
But the First Nation, the Ojibwe, are really fighting that, just like Mattawa, the Algonquins are fighting that, and they're getting help from the MNC to win that because MNC always said that they're not, Métis historic communities. So we'll see what happens. And then as you progress, you get power, you got money, like you're going to self-governing. But the people will have to find out later on, like it's fine to have the power, the money that the government gives you, the funding that you get. But when that funding goes away, they're gonna go back to the old way when the Métis voyeurs had to pay a sum of their salaries back to the corporate. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Uh, I do believe that they're gonna have a tax to pay, some type of money to give back to the organization just to keep it going.
Mhm.
So it's something to think about, because a lot of First Nation are the same in the same boat with the child care. Um, like they're self-governing. A lot of chiefs are backing up because they say they don't have the money to take care of that, because the governments are telling them you're self-governing now. So if you want to take care of what do you call those centers, childcare, they're you know what I mean? But they say no, we can't. So they want to get away from it. They still want the funding and let the government take care of their own children because they don't have the money to run those places. So it's going to get complicated down the road.
Yeah. So, and not sure if I understand fully. So my understanding would be that things like childcare, healthcare, education should be, it should be through the province for, um, anyone who's living in Ontario, but because of the Constitution Act, it would be um, um, really categorized under the federal government. So in this situation, isn't it similar in that state that the Constitution Act or Section 35 would protect all Aboriginal people, including Métis individual? I'm assuming only if they're carded or only if they're citizens, that it would be through the Constitution Act that we would be have those self-governing arrangements.
Yeah, because when you're verified right now, I don't believe that the Métis are with the federal. They're like their verified card is registered with the provincial governments, um, but I don't believe they are with the federal yet. But you could probably get funding for education and all that through the federal, because if you're verified in Ontario. Uh, but when you get governing by their own, the governments are now saying that you stand by yourself. So it's going to be up to you to get your own businesses, whatever, to generate money to keep you people going with the lands claims and all that. So
Mm-hmm.
it's uh, it's not big talks right now, but it's coming in 2-3 years from now. That's what they're going to be talking about, because the funding they get 300 million is for 4 or 5 years to get them established. Whatever, they share it, and because if you think about MNO, let's say, like, that's a big organization. They got 29 communities. They got a lot of buildings that they don't rent or own or employ staff that to pay. A lot of staff are paid by government because it's represents the three peoples, right? So Inuit, First Nation, or Métis. So it's not directly MNO paying for those salaries,
Mm-hmm.
but other salaries it's MNO. So after the funding is gone, who's going to be paying for all that? Somebody has to pay for the salaries, the buildings, utilities. Manitoba is pretty safe because they're getting most of the money, right?
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
You have me thinking yet again, Rick. Always thinking about new topics every time we talk.
I know. That's because my wheels keeps turning. I don't know. I dream.
You're daydreaming. Uh,
Yeah.
and I'm wondering if, there's been talks of UNDRIP, right? The United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. And so this always seems like a really great thing to be implemented in Canada. But we heard from lots of individuals. Ross Diabo was with us a few months ago and talking about the dangers of adopting UNDRIP because of the damage it could do to the Constitution Act, that it would be a way of eliminating Section 35 of the Constitution Act, which would eliminate all Aboriginal rights. So under the disguise of saying self-governing, it's a way of cutting off rights, services, mostly to Aboriginal people from coast to coast. Do you think that there's a link there between UNDRIP and what they're trying to move towards?
Yeah, I believe that's what's happening right now. They're moving towards that, to eliminate the funding going to them,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But there's not too much discussion on it right now. We just gotta wait and see.
You have to wait and see.
Wait and see. But
Hmm.
be loud. Make your voice hear.
So we have a question. So I'll pass it over to Lynn if you want to ask your question directly.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Rick, for your sharing your experiences and knowledge in terms of French River and MNO and the greater Métis Nation or Métis peoples across Canada as well. I don't know if you're aware of it, you probably are, but I just was wondering if you'd commented on it. There's a community in Northern Alberta, a Métis community, I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is they were verified through the Métis Organization of Alberta, and then they chose to separate and negotiate with the federal government on their own. So what it presents is a different way of Métis groups verified by the governments that were or are in place today, moving to separate and then entering into negotiations at the federal level, because essentially we are under the auspice, with or without all of the negotiations that take place with the provincial governments, we're under the auspices of the federal government now as a Métis people. So I just wanted you to think about, or if you could comment on that one, if you can.
Yeah, that community was, they were pretty smart because, yeah, like you say, they got verified by the Alberta Métis Association there. But then, because that organization was fighting with the provincial and federal governments, they said, well, we should go by ourselves. So they talked to the provincial government and they said, sure. You know, provincial government will say, sure, we're fighting with them. So if you want to be alone, we'll negotiate just with you. You know what I mean? It eliminates a lot of people. So that's what happened there. And they did a good deal. They received a lot of money for just a small community. I can't remember how many citizens there, but not too many anyways. But they, with a big chunk of money, and now they're established now, you know, like, but I could see like Mattawa, Blind River, Killarney, if they do become historic communities, like they say they are now, but you know, it's all going to courts with the Algonquin and the Ojibways, Manitoulin Island. You know, they're going to be fighting this. But if they stay historic Métis communities, they could pull anybody that's connected to Mattawa. They could pull away because you don't have to belong to an organization after. You're people, recognized people in that community. So like anybody that's verified with MNO right now probably could pull away and join another organization because they got their verified papers, let's say, registered with MNO. And I don't know if they're registered with MNC because Clem is a little bit different there. I don't know if he accepted them or not. But as long as they got those papers, they could do whatever they want, as long as they stay in their territory. And basically, that's what's happening here with ours, let's say.
I think I have a related question, Rick, because I saw recently in a paper a decision for the city of Ottawa, who negotiated on a land deal of some sort with Algonquins of Ontario. And there was an Algonquin First Nation who sent a letter out because they were displeased, I think with good reason, that they were negotiating with the wrong community, essentially. So I think there in Ontario, like you said, there's people who were once identifying as Métis and who are now identifying as Algonquin, because I think they don't really know where they fit in. So my concern with all of this is when you have, you know, and we've seen it in Quebec and in other provinces where there are inappropriate land deals going on, where you have people who are claiming to be Métis who are leaving out First Nations of land deals or consultation and things like that. So how much of that is a risk when you have a government or an industry saying basically who's going to play ball? And so they choose which community will be the ones to consult with on a land deal, when really they should be probably consulting with everyone, especially when with the Algonquin people, and there's no treaty at this time. There's no historic treaty. So how do we navigate that conversation, making sure that we're doing things in the right way, and to be able to make sure that the people having those conversations are at the table for the right reason?
Yeah, Yeah, the Algonquin is very complicated too because you just came out with a criteria that if you claim to be Algonquin, uh, they check your ancestry. They say, yes, for sure you are Algonquin. No doubt about it. But if yourself or your mother and father weren't born in the Algonquin territory before 1897, you cannot be part of the Algonquin nation. So let's say me, my grandfather would have been born, let's say in 1904. So that's after 1897. So I can't I can't consider myself being a Algonquin, let's say, a card holder, because I'm outside that year. Uh, yeah, it takes because the Algonquins from Quebec are fighting the same thing. They say that they're overlapping over here from the old days, and then the Algonquins they want to extend their territory, right? And then you got the what's fascinating is the Algonquin godmothers of a certain area. They challenged that treaty right, saying that if they're going to have an Algonquin treaty, it should be consist of all Algonquins living in the territory or outside the territory. That's why that treaty is not signed yet. They got a good lawyer, and he keeps blocking and blocking and blocking. So everybody's anxious to see what's happening because a lot of people that are Métis people, let's say from the Mattawa region, well, their their descendants are Algonquins, right? So if they get the right, well, I could see a big flow changing to Algonquin instead of Métis, right? So yeah, that's what it is.
I think we understand that it's just very complicated. There's so much history to know. And I think sometimes the culture is what's most obvious to everyone, right? You can see it in your family, you can see it when you meet communities that you maybe never met before, but you see that communal culture. So we see that it's very complicated. I'm still trying to learn more and more, but I see how intense it can be. So thanks for sharing on that, on what you can, right? Lynn, you have another question?
I just want to mention that history is a colonial history, and I'll just talk about the Northwest Triangle Treaty. It's one of the treaties that has Métis included actually in the treaty. And what's complicated about the treaties in this colonial past is it's a past of exclusion. And the only reason that Métis were included in that treaty was an adhesion, it was like an afterthought. So then it starts making you wonder how many afterthoughts. And I think when you say it's complicated, history is complicated. Mm-hmm. History has been written by people that didn't represent Indigenous peoples of Canada. Mm-hmm. And so who's written in and who's written out is really grossly not even visible. And I don't know if it'll ever be visible. So I think that's the complication that as Métis that we face in this world as well, is this being written out of history at various times. So the complication and thinking about history, we have to constantly keep in mind of whose histories are we talking about and who's actually designated who's who in this. And we're constantly within the parameters of a colonial system that we keep fighting amongst ourselves over. So it is complicated, Emily, extremely. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks for your comment. Yeah, and it's complicated, and I think we see through the court cases that it becomes even more complicated, and it seems that going to court is a renewal of colonial history, right, being imposed through that system. But it seems to be the only way to make some kind of leeway through activism, through having your voices heard and building communities, but through the courts. Seems to be the one way that we can step forward and hopefully build lasting rights that won't be taken away. So I always struggle with all of these conversations because growing up, what do we mean by Métis? What do we mean by métissage? And as a French Canadian, I know that word and those words mean something different to everyone. And within my own cultural understanding. That's changed through time. So I always appreciate hearing everybody's perspective on these things, because we all have we all have cultural perspectives and cultural identities that should be acknowledged and really engaged in. So yeah, I appreciate being able to talk about these. Are there any other questions or comments on anything we've discussed today? We've shared some links in the chat. We're reaching the end of our talk. I think we could go for days probably and still be learning. So this is one of our events for this week. Yesterday we had 2 events with the MNO in terms of services and cultural programs. So please check out our YouTube channel. You can go look at those and previous events that we've hosted. I want to really say a sincere thank you to Rick for once again sharing with us and teaching me more. So my wheels are turning and I'm going to have to go do some more homework to figure out how to navigate some of these questions. We also have an event tomorrow, which is pre-recorded. We recorded that last year with Tony Belcourt. And so he went through the history of the MNO and the implications in the Constitution Act, Section 35. So that's a really worthwhile watch. Lots of historical context on that. And I really appreciate Rick was also part of that talk. And so he was able to ask some questions to Tony. And it's interesting to see, how do we take steps forward that is done in the right way and that it's productive so that we can have better communities and better access to the resources that we need. So don't miss that tomorrow. And we are also having a viewing of Where the Fiddle Flows on Friday. So you can check that out as well. Look at our online schedule. So I'll give it a last chance if anyone has any questions or comments for Rick before we go. Lots of thank yous in the chat. People are grateful.
Do we have to re-register to listen tomorrow?
I don't believe you have to re-register. No, you should be able to join the link. And okay. for the Tony Belcourt video, it's a YouTube video that you can watch that we recorded last year.
Okay, thank you.
I just wanted to say hello to Nicole McDonald there.
Nicole est cachée.
Hey?
Nicole est cachée.
Hey, cachée. And she's got her mic off, so I'm just saying hello to her. She used to sit on console with us. Great lady.
All right. So thank you to every single one of you for joining us today. We really appreciate your participation, and please feel free to check out our events this week. If you have any questions for Rick, I think he's always willing to have conversations with people so that we can improve dialogue. And Amy's shared the YouTube link for tomorrow, just for your information. All right.
Well, thank you. Big wish to you, Emily, and Amy for inviting me to this talk. Anytime, always available. Big wish.
Merci. Merci beaucoup, Richard. Thank you to everyone. Hope you have a great week. Wow.